thank you everybody for joining us today for the Fireside Chat. And with me are Tom and Rob. I will get to introductions in a super quick second. Just to give you guys a quick introduction for those of you who haven't been looking at what's happening in MidMean recently, we've been talking about FSJam, which we believe is the future of JavaScript and microservices and serverless. And it's something that I've been thinking about for a few months, and I've been seeing, and it's been making waves, AWS Lambda, the nice thing about this conversation is that we have somebody over here who was with FSJam and Jamstack before it was even called Jamstack. And that was when Jekyll was around. So I guess that's a pretty good segue into introducing Tom and Rob. Tom, you are the co-founder of GitHub most famously, but also equally famously among dev circles, the creator of Jekyll, of SemVer, and of Gravatar, and you're working on Chatterbug, which is a startup right now. And you're here today to talk about RedwoodJS and Chatterbug and the future of JavaScript and what you see the web turning into in the next several years. So Tom, welcome to MidMean. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you here. Rob, you're working on the RedwoodJS core team. I believe you're the core, one of the core contributors at Redwood, and you're making a lot of contributions to Redwood right now, especially helping people onboard onto Redwood, which is awesome. And I'm so happy to have you over here because you're going to add a voice to this conversation that's going to be very useful to people who are wondering how to get into open source, how to get into Redwood. So both of you, thank you so much for being over here. I'm so excited for this conversation to happen.
Well, thank you for having us. I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Me too.
So to kick this conversation off, let's see, how shall we kick this off? You know what? Let's start with what's happening right now. What is a serverless FSJam stuff? Can I eat it with peanut butter? And is it deployable to my Raspberry Pi? I don't know what it is. Treat me like a dummy. What's FSJam?
So FSJam stands for, that's short for Full Stack Jamstack. So we'll start with Jamstack. So Jamstack is a stack of technologies that you can use together to put websites and web applications online. So the Jam in Jamstack stands for JavaScript, APIs, and markup, so JAM. And you might be familiar with these if you've done any static site generating with something like Jekyll, or Gatsby can fall within this realm, Hugo. There's a whole bunch of static site generators, and that's kind of what we called them before. And you generate static sites, so that's the markup, the M in Jamstack. And then you might start wanting to add some functionality, something dynamic to those pages. And you'd serve them just off of regular file servers or a content delivery network, a CDN. And so they're static, like there is no database, there's no server behind it. But if you want to do something dynamic, then you're going to need JavaScript. So you start using JavaScript on the page, and to get data from somewhere dynamic, then you probably use some third-party API, and that's where the A in Jamstack comes from. So generally, when you're thinking about Jamstack in the traditionally defined way, the APIs are third-party APIs. You'll use JavaScript on your static page to connect to those APIs, pull data, and put those onto the website. And this is a really powerful way to do a certain class of websites that you might want, really especially good for content-heavy sites, weblogs, magazines, things like that. E-commerce can work very well here using third-party APIs. But where it doesn't succeed as well is when you're trying to do a full stack application with a lot of custom business logic, because the question is, where do you put your business logic? Well, you probably want a database that you're going to connect to. Think the things that you would do with Rails, Ruby on Rails, or similar frameworks. And so full stack Jamstack is really the idea that can we extend what Jamstack can do to make it work also in full stack applications? And so Redwood is an attempt at doing that. And there's a couple of ways that people are trying to do that today that have just come out over the last 6 or 7 months. And so Redwood's take on that is to still deploy to the Jamstack using something like Netlify, or we just launched the ability to deploy to Vercel. And you still need to host your database somewhere. So that's one piece that is not quite in the Jamstack serverless world. You still have to get a database up and running. We're hoping that that process becomes much easier, and we're working with these vendors to hopefully make that work easier. But then you can put your business logic into Lambda functions. So let's just talk about Netlify. So Netlify, you can have a static site, but if you put code in a certain place in your repository, Netlify will pick it up and deploy that to Amazon Lambda functions. And then you can use that as your own API. So it's still an API. You still connect to it from your static site with JavaScript, but it's an API that you've created yourself. And so when they came out with that functionality, I saw that and it made me think, finally, like, here's a way that we can use Jamstack to go towards full stack. And so that's what Redwood is really trying to do, trying to be a framework around these concepts that make it really easy to do full stack on the Jamstack. But what we're finding is that not everyone necessarily even wants to do that yet. And so Redwood will also work in a more traditional fashion where you have servers and you deploy it on something like Amazon or your own machines or whatever you wanted to do. So while the crux of it, the thesis of it started with this Jamstack idea, we want to extend it so that you can deploy into really any environment that you want, because there's nothing fundamentally restrictive about it that would prevent you from doing that. So that's where we started, and that's kind of also where we're going.
So, all right, so I'm going to play devil's mannequin and be a complete crash test dummy for this, and I'm going to ask a few questions that'll help me understand this. So you're saying that before, well, to use an analogy, before Gutenberg came out with his printing press, you had these large rooms full of people that are copying stuff over, and it was a very manual process. And then the printing press came out, and now you could print 5,000, 10,000 books just at one go. And the movable type thing made that really easy to do that. So are you saying that full stack gem, FSGem, is basically that for full stack servers? It sounds like what you're saying is, instead of having to manage builds and deploys manually, setting up my own CI/CD pipeline, deploying the stuff to the server, making sure everything is running, making sure uptime is meeting SLA levels, you're saying that somebody else will manage all of that for me and they'll do all the hard work so I can just deploy directly to the web much faster, much easier. Is that what FSGem is? Did I understand correctly?
Yeah, that's the dream. And it's a concept that I've been chasing for a long time, ever since Heroku came out. And Heroku is amazing and still is amazing in a lot of ways, but it hasn't fully embraced some of the modern ways that I want to do things. And what I've been looking for is, I tend to call it a universal deployment machine. It's the concept that you have code, you write code in a repository, you can push it up to GitHub, and then something, the universal deployment machine, will take that code and just put it online, right? I don't have to worry about servers. I don't have to worry about databases. I don't have to worry about where the code runs. I don't have to worry about any of these things. I just write code. That's what I'm good at. That's what I know how to do. And let the machine do more for me. And so Jamstack actually starts looking a lot like this universal deployment machine, minus some of the things on the database side. But I think we're still really early in this. And if we follow this trend, and I think some of these companies are really starting to think about the data side of this, because they sense, Netlify, Vercel, related companies are seeing that full stack is possible in a Jamstack workflow. And that if we can nail that, then that opens up web development to an even broader set of people and removes a lot of the pain of figuring out how to deploy and how to scale. Scaling is you can get something online. That's not the most difficult thing in the world. It's still hard in most cases. But figuring out how to scale from 10 users to 1,000 to 10,000 to 1 million to 10 million, that is hard and very, very expensive. And with the Jamstack style of architecture, we could make it to where you barely even have to think about it someday.
So, Rob, I'm going to throw you this one. We have at Mint Bean a lot of newer developers coming into the community. When they attend a hackathon, the first problem we have, and we're trying to solve this ourselves using an open source CLI that we have called Mint Bean CLI. And what that does is it helps you do those deployments right now, but it's basically just a task runner that does a push from your local. And even that is helping developers just deploy faster. And what I'm seeing is, it's really hard to teach somebody how to deploy. How are you like, is this a problem that you guys are addressing in your documentation? I know that you're writing tutorials about this. You have a wonderful tutorial up on the RedwoodJS site. What gaps do you see right now from a documentation perspective that you see people struggling with elsewhere, and you maybe have fixed using either code or documentation? Like, could you give us some more examples of how this deployment problem has become easier in Redwood?
Yeah, we actually just talked about, it was like 2 days ago, we talked about adding a command, yarn redwood deploy, and then you'll put in Netlify, Vercel, AWS, Docker. So we'll kind of handle all those logistics for you. Yeah, I mean, when you're doing it with something like Netlify, like it's so, and that's the reason that they were our first target. It's like so simple to do it from Netlify. You can actually all do it from Netlify's end. You log in, you link to your GitHub account, you pick your repo, and you say go, and now your site is live. It was like magic. So like I've used Heroku before, and Heroku was magic for Rails at the time, but Netlify is like taking it to a whole nother level. So it seems like a lot of these more these universal deployment as a service vendors are starting to come out more like Netlify and Vercel. So it might take that deployment problem and it'll just go away, and it won't even be something you have to think about or worry about anymore. But for right now, it's still, we have to document and tell you how to do it. And the tutorial explains, and it's like one of the shortest sections of the tutorial, ironically, is deployment, which is traditionally like the hardest thing, setting up servers and worrying about memory and disk space and performance. And now it's like a couple paragraphs in the tutorial and your site is live to the internet that millions of people can see instantly. It's amazing. So yeah, I think the next step for us will be that command, I think. So we'll have a Redwood deploy command to abstract it even farther, so it's even less to worry about.
So it's all magic. You guys sound like Rails developers. You've lost all credibility in my eyes. Oh my god.
Well, it's magic. The thing though is you want some magic, but you don't want too much magic. And honestly, Rails has quite a bit of magic, like very, very deep into the framework. And Redwood actually has a lot less. We do a few things that are a little bit magical, but in general, we're not hiding huge amounts of code from you, which I find with Rails, it can be very difficult sometimes because of how much code there is in the framework, that it can be difficult to figure out what's happening, what the framework is doing for you. And I think the learning curve can be very, very high because the framework can do so much for you. And especially getting into someone else's Rails project can be very, very challenging as well. I mean, this is true for really any project that gets large enough, but there is a huge amount of magic in Rails. We're trying to do maybe a little less magic with Redwood. There are some places that we do things for you in like cells, the declarative data fetching. There is some magic that we hide, but it's very minimal. It's like 30, 40 lines of code or something. It's just a simple wrapper to a file that turns it into a component that will do data fetching for you. And it saves you a lot of time and allows you to think more clearly about the problem that you're solving. And so that, I think, we're trying to strike the balance between having enough magic to where you're not having to write a lot of boilerplate and you're not having to jump through a lot of hoops because the framework isn't doing anything for you, versus trying to provide huge amounts of functionality that are doing magical things that are hidden from you, which can slow you down in the long run.
So it sounds like, so I did a bit of Rails too, admission of guilt on my end as well. And I did about a year or two of Rails before. I've done JavaScript, Rails. That's kind of my background. And right now, from my own perspective, JavaScript is very much like Java in philosophy. They want everything explicit. They want everything up front. You don't want to hide anything behind layers of code. Rails is coming in from the complete opposite. And it sounds like you're dealing with that philosophy, that philosophical cultural difference between the two languages in a unique way. Like, can you tell us what the philosophy of, what is this? It sounds like you're doing something very different, which I know after taking a look at Redwood, I know you are. But again, devil's mannequin, tell me more about why do you want to do things this way? Why are you bringing age-old Rails philosophy into JavaScript? What's missing in JavaScript that you feel like you need to fix it using magic? What's the deal here?
I think it's not like adding magic isn't necessarily the thing that we're after or that drives us. It's more integration. Like we're in a place now in the Node and JavaScript, TypeScript universe where there are many, many solutions to many different problems. And in the React world, you have 1,000 ways that you can do things. And so trying to find a set of technologies that works well together can feel a little bit lonely and difficult to find best practices. So I found this at Chatterbug, the current startup that I'm working at. Peter, one of the other core developers who started Redwood with me very early on, we are both working at Chatterbug. We were at the time. Peter has now left and is doing Redwood mostly full-time and kind of doing his own startup now. We started seeing how difficult it was to put together a React application and how we kept bouncing between technologies, trying to find best practices, thinking about the best ways to do things, even just simple things like what should the file structure be? What's the directory structure? Where do files go? Those things, like there wasn't a lot of information out there about or agreement on like what's the right way to do this. And it seemed ridiculous to me as someone who's trying to build an application to be spending time thinking about where my files go on disk. Like it's just not something that I should be doing as a creator of a startup. Like, it's a huge waste of time. And so Redwood, a big part of Redwood is making technology decisions and creating conventions around where you put things, how you do data fetching, just what the Webpack config looks like. I mean, the number of hours that we've spent getting the Webpack to work exactly the way that it should for the set of tools that we're integrating it's like 20, 30, 40, 50 hours. I don't know. It's a lot, right? And right now, everybody is doing that for their own project over and over and over again. And it seems to me like a large waste of resources where people could be focusing on what makes their businesses special. And if we can nail this and we can create conventions the same way that Rails did exactly the same thing. And I did Rails for a decade or more, 15 years. And Rails is great. I have my problems with Rails. I have my problems with everything, right? But Rails really fundamentally changed like what we think of as a web application framework and what's possible and how much time the framework can save you. But the thing that Rails didn't do was evolve with the JavaScript ecosystem, right? They just stopped. They went their own separate way, right? So Rails went its own sort of way with stimulus and very light. Like the philosophy there is as little JavaScript as possible, where React and friends are kind of like as much JavaScript as possible. And to me, the React won in my mind. Like I don't want to create a site without React or something that looks very much like React. Like I just have no interest in doing that. Like it would make me very sad. It's like, to me, the change is like going from PHP to Rails, Ruby and Rails, like that, the feeling that you had doing that is the same feeling that I had going from Rails to React. And that sort of methodology where I'm like, one way, data propagation, compartmentalized, components that wrap up all of their CSS and logic, and that can be reused across my entire website, and then I can create a design system out of, and then I can plug into Storybook and be able to develop on their own. All of this and the state management that's available, all of this is something that I can't imagine giving up. Like going back to the old ways of like trying to figure out what goes in my view and what goes in my model. Like it's just so uninteresting to me because we have these new patterns and these new patterns are better. And so Redwood is trying to capture those new patterns, but wrap it in a framework that gives you the same powers that Rails has, with the addition of being able to deploy to something like Netlify, where you don't even have to think about how you're deploying anymore.
So I had that feeling of, oh my God, this is crazy when I touched Rails. And it was just, you could have 3 models and 5 pages up with full database connections in a weekend, which back then, even now, in many ways, it's still magic. It's like, wow. Right. And it just blew my mind. And I saw Rails kind of just insinuate itself into other communities. And now the MVC framework pattern with ORMs and everything, it's everywhere. It's in Java, it's in JavaScript, PHP, Python. You have it everywhere. And React kind of feels the same way. It's making stuff easier for developers, but But how does this matter for somebody who's running a company or running a team? Why would you even want to worry about Redwood? I mean, you have you have tried and tested JavaScript frameworks like React, and you have tried and tested architectural patterns like MVC. Why would somebody want to invest their team's time into learning Redwood? Like, just why?
Well, to me, it's about a set of technologies. So React, so we'll start by saying, I don't think of React as a framework. Like, to me, React is a library. It's a front-end rendering library. Like, to call it a framework is a bit of a stretch, and that's not intended to be an insult to React. React is amazing. Obviously, I love it. But it's not like, you're not like, I'm going to go write a website. I'm going to build it with React. Like, what does that mean? You need more than React to build something, right? It's not a framework, and it is very unopinionated about most things that you do. You can do things in a lot of different ways with it, but where do you get your data from, right? Like, it's like, I don't know, you get your data from wherever you want. It's like, how do you do deep state management? It's like, I don't know, you figure it out, right? Like, it's not a framework. A framework to me is something like Rails, and so React. This is just how I think about it mentally, so that I can keep things straight and explain them well. React is a rendering and like local state management tool, and it does that extremely well. But if you want to create a web application, then you need a lot of other tools to use along with it. And if that's the case, and not even that, but then, like, for the actual application that you deploy, but then other work chain tools that come along with it, like, how do you do testing? React doesn't care how you do testing. How do you do something like Storybook? Like, if you want to leverage the power of React and be able to work on your components in isolation outside of your application, which is an amazing pattern, and then be able to iterate over all of the possible states so that you can show developers like what's possible and document them in a separate tool like Storybook. React doesn't care. React has no care in the world about how or even if you do that. Right, so the framework that Redwood represents is more than just a set of technologies. It's also intended to be a workflow, and we're not quite there yet with what you can do with Redwood. We're still building out some of the testing things. Storybook, we just got integrated in like the last release, or two releases ago, maybe a month ago, and it's still very basic. There's still a lot of things we want to do there. There's some nice things that you can do already, but there are even more nice things that we want you to be able to do. So it's all of that combined with then all of those workflow things combined with then a deployment methodology that could allow you to scale and be globally distributed. Maybe not quite yet, right? And we don't pretend to be like Redwood is not what it will be. What we want for Redwood is something that Redwood will be in a year or two. Like, it will be usable, it will be great when we hit 1.0. I mean, it's great right now, but it will be like super great when we hit 1.0, hopefully by the end of the year. And you'll be able to use it for real production things, and we endorse you doing that with it. But some things will be more difficult than they should, like the database side of it, right? We want you to eventually be able to not have to worry about scaling, because your React client is on a CDN distributed around the world. Your business logic could be in Lambdas distributed around the world. The missing piece then is your database. So can we find a database that's distributed around the world? And there are starting to be some really good options, like FaunaDB fits that scenario. It's not as easy to use for the developer as I would like it to be. And we use Prisma right now to talk in your business logic, in your GraphQL API, to talk to the database. We use Prisma, which is a query builder. They will eventually support Fauna and other NoSQL databases, Mongo, et cetera. And that will be super amazing, but that's going to take some time too. So Redwood, we wanted to start it because we saw the possibility and knew that it was going to take a long time to build it and to get there, but we wanted to be there for that journey and to be there when those technologies reached the point that they were perfect for this style of development, that Redwood would already be there being like, all right, like, we're now going to leverage this as much as possible, instead of realizing 2 years from now that, like, oh, now you can do this, and then starting. We wanted to be there when it happened. So for the person building a business, it's really about, like, do you like this workflow? Do you like the ideas of the Jamstack and being able to deploy and scale more easily than you have been able to before, and just the way that you build applications with React and these new technologies.
Yeah, I can just hear my all my Rails buddies just going, yes, like that makes sense. There's the Rails guy inside me is going, yes, that makes sense, because JavaScript is just so painful that way. My friend Wesley Nelson asked a question that basically you just answered, which was, how does this differ from other JavaScript frameworks? Because whenever I'm sure even when you hear a new JavaScript framework, so what? It's just more of the same or slight incremental evolutions, but this just totally makes sense. I don't have to worry about anything except my business logic. So I can hear him going, yeah.
I think that's a perfect way to put it. That's the perfect way to put it. Like all the other things, and including the workflow and deployment flow, like those are things that we care about and that we want Redwood to be able to take care of for you. And I don't know of any other JavaScript framework that even approaches or attempts to do that. There's a lot of pieces, there's a lot of frameworks, but they're much smaller. Redwood intends to be much larger in scope, where it's talking about this whole workflow. It's trying to be a really competent framework for very large projects down the road. And so we think a lot about maintainability and what long-term maintainability looks like for a Redwood project. And splitting the front end and the back end very explicitly and having GraphQL in between is part of that long-term maintainability, in separating those concerns, making sure you have these different things isolated and packaged. You've got components on the front end. In Redwood, you have what we call services on the back end that encapsulate chunks of your business logic. And then these services call each other, even internally, in a Lambda. These services will make calls between each other as if they were APIs. And we make all of that really easy for you to hook up. But in boiling things down to APIs, encapsulation plus APIs, that gives you long-term maintainability. So if you can enforce that or encourage that, and then make it easy to follow those patterns, then that can get you a really long way towards organizing your code, making it easier to change over time, which is maintainability. And that's how you maintain velocity as a mature company, right? Every Rails project I've ever worked on turns into spaghetti very rapidly, and maybe I'm just not that good of a developer, but I've done it several times now. And it's just, Rails doesn't provide a large number of patterns for you to follow to do that out of the box. It's like people have developed some of these things. But I want Redwood to go further in sort of saying, like, do it this way. This is the right way to think about managing complexity over the long term. And we have the tools and we've built things in for you to manage that, instead of sort of leaving that as an exercise to the community at large.
So Rob, because you're writing a lot of this documentation for Redwood, and you're trying to make it as easy as possible for newbies coming in, do you feel like new people coming into Redwood are going to learn more than just one more framework? Because I'm hearing a lot of names in here that are familiar but unfamiliar to many. GraphQL, Prisma, you have serverless. So, is this something that, two-part question, A, is this something that a newbie should be getting into? And B, Bill Liu had a question. What's your best advice to start with open source? And how can you get over the overwhelm of getting into an open source community? And I was wondering maybe if you could address the two. So is this a good framework for newbies to learn? And can newbies actually start their open source journey with Redwood?
I think it's good for newbies to learn. Like Tom was saying, our tutorial is very gentle, sort of introduces you into things. It kind of assumes like it's not going to explain to you from scratch what GraphQL is. It's not going to explain from scratch what Prisma is. It kind of assumes you know the concept of a database. But it's a good jumping off point if you want to then go and learn those. Like you can make it through the tutorial and not have to know how SQL works in a database to make it through the tutorial and have an app that works. But then that gives you a good spot to jump off. Like, oh, no, I want to learn more about how databases are implemented, or I want to learn more about the details of GraphQL and how that works behind the scenes. And Tom hasn't mentioned this yet, but we kind of practice something that he kind of coined called tutorial-driven development, where we basically wrote the tutorial first of how we wanted the app to work and the developer experience of using Redwood, and then we made Redwood work that way. So it's a very interesting way to come at the problem. But I mean, that developer interface to the framework, I mean, that's everything. That's all that really matters. So that's what you want to really lock in and get perfect. And having the framework do that, that's something that computers need to worry about, making these parts work so that humans can get their job done simpler and easier. So we feel like we've done a good job with that tutorial. So I would say, yes, it's a good spot for newbies to start. However, you'll probably need to, on your own time, dig in a little bit more to GraphQL and Prisma and get into more of those details. And if you have questions, please come and ask us. Like, we're the nicest community I've worked with in the development world. So we'll answer any questions you have. And, you know, we have a discourse forum. We have I always get discourse and Discord mixed up, Discord chat server. So please come on and talk to us. That was part one. Part two was how do you get started in open source?
Yeah. How do you get started? How do you get over the overwhelm? And how can Redwood maybe, are you accepting contributions from outside?
We just put up our full list. I think we have more than 100 people that have contributed. Some have contributed a single fix for a typo, and others have contributed role-based authentication. So there's a whole range of everything. We have several issues that are marked, good first issue. We feel like it's a sort of an isolated problem that doesn't touch the entirety of the framework. So it's not like overwhelming to get involved if you need to make a fix. But I think a good place to get started in open source is actually documentation. Like, documentation can never be thorough enough. So there's always gaps in what's written. And if you're going through the tutorial, or you're using some particular thing, form helpers or whatever, and something isn't clear to you, check it out in documentation. Like, help us expand it. Maybe something just could be worded just a little bit different. Maybe there's a step missing in the tutorial, or there could be entire functions that aren't documented at all, and you could really help out people that come after you with those docs.
Yeah, or even just a typo. Like, sometimes it just takes one pull request to get over that the hump of like, is it appropriate for me to contribute to this project? And you're reading through the documentation trying to figure it out, and you find a passage that is maybe unclear, has a grammar mistake or typo or something. It's totally appropriate to be like, here's a 1 character change in a pull request. And we'd be like, honestly, those are the best pull requests, because you're just like, yeah, commit, right? Like, you just accept them. You don't have to be like, all right, I'm gonna go pull this down. I'm gonna test it. I'm gonna run it against the test suite. I'm gonna figure out, right? Like, with these one character changes, they're super easy to pull in. And it gets people past the barrier of feeling like, is it like, can they be included? Can they contribute? And so definitely that's a good place to start. I'd say we love contributors. I really want the Redwood community to be the best that there is of any open source project that has ever been. That's sort of my dream for Redwood. I think we have an opportunity. It's a large enough and ambitious enough of a project that we can really think about a large and vibrant and diverse community. And it's going to be challenging. It's going to be challenging to reach some of these points, especially around diversity. Like, it's just not, you don't naturally, in the open source world right now, get a lot of people that aren't white men. It's just not, like, if you want that to be different, then you have to work at it. And so that's what we found. Like, we found that we're not a particularly diverse group right now. And that means that we have to consciously go and find and include people in the community and really make it very welcoming in order to reach that. And so that's work that we're doing right now. So it's very much on our mind, but like, I want to be super intentional about it. I think we have the opportunity to create a community unlike the world has seen and include more people than most communities include. So that's definitely on our mind. We promise to be friendly. We promise that you'll always feel good in this community, unless you're violating the code of conduct, in which case you may find yourself asked to leave. But I mean, that's part of having a great community, right? If you come in with good intentions, then you will be embraced.
We've had people on issues open ask, like, if I wanted to help with this issue, where would I get started? And I've gone through the code and found out, okay, take a look at this file, take a look at these lines of code. Here's where I think you want to go, and they'll, do a couple code changes. Like, what do you think about this? And I've commented back, and we've kind of like almost pair programmed on fixing a feature as just as someone's first pull request. It was great. It was a great opportunity, and we would be happy to do that for anybody else that wants to come along. And if you don't know where to start, just ask us. We'll gladly walk you through something.
And is this something that, this is something that, because you guys have a different perspective on GitHub, is this something, I think you guys would be able to tell us this, is this something that you see as a problem in most open source communities, where most of them are maybe non-diverse, maybe most of them are a little close to contributions, and you're being mindful about that in Redwood? Is this a systemic thing that's just there in open source? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think it's definitely systemic. I mean, it all is, especially in the United States, throughout the world. The demographics of people who are developers is highly skewed. And so you see that reflected in open source, but even more so, because to get involved in open source, often who starts spending time doing open source? It's the people with time to spend. And who are those people? They're going to be people that make enough money or come from a wealthy enough background to be able to spend the time doing open source and not be paid for it. And it's just, if you go into a community and nobody looks like you do, then it generally tends not to be very welcoming. So just by virtue of the demographics of software development overall, that's a problem. It's exacerbated even more in open source, something that's sort of this optional thing that you can do that is additional work, right? And so it's everywhere. And you have to be, I think, very intentional to create something that's different than a 90 to 95% white male contributor base. Like if you go look at the contributors to Redwood right now, you'll see, you can see it. Like, so, and this is, so like naturally, like we can put Redwood out there and we can say, all right, hey, we'll take contributions from anybody. But it's insufficient to get any level of diversity in the contributorship, just because this is just the state of open source. This is just how it is, right? And you can look at all the reasons why that is.
I think it also it's kind of a self-fulfilling / vicious cycle too, because if everybody in open source is from a certain demographic, there's probably not enough outreach to other communities just naturally. I think it's great what you guys are doing. I think the world needs it, because we're seeing about at MintBean, we see, guesstimating 30 to 35% female developers coming in. At MintBean, we're seeing, we've had people from extremely diverse backgrounds winning hackathons and being active in that community. And it's just really amazing that somebody from the open source world, from the deep open source world, is coming out and reaching out to our community. I want to applaud you for that, because honestly, not many people are. I don't think many people even see this as an issue in open source. I mean, open source is great, but it's really encouraging that you guys are looking for that kind of input, and you are reaching out to people.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely part of why we're here. It's really awesome what you're doing. I love speaking to and appealing to young developers, people in boot camps, and the demographics are often better earlier on, right? So people tend to drop out over time because of how this industry is. It forces people out. And so getting them early, welcoming them, getting them into open source, showing how that they can leverage that for their careers. Like, this is all stuff that I love.
There's it's the identity thing is interesting. I find that technology, like learning technology, knowing technology, is very agnostic in terms of who you are on one hand. On the other hand, there's that weird the weird skewing, especially when you consider the first developers were mostly women. I mean, the first developer who developed without a machine at all, who just wrote programs, was Lady Ada Lovelace, and that kind of just acts as my touchstone whenever I think, oh man, this industry is a certain way. Then I always remember.
Well, there's the phrase computers referred to the women who would hand compute. It was astronomical calculations, I believe, and the women were the computers. That was what they were called. Do you mention anyone mention this book yet, Tom?
Not yet. Yeah, that's a great book. A lot of us are reading that right now. It's Nadia Agmal, who's
working in public. Yep. Is that the one, Working in Public?
This book just came out. This came out very recently. It's kind of a study of the open source community and how it works and who are the people that are doing it, what different types of open source projects are there. Nadia worked at GitHub for a time, and she spent years and years studying. It's very hard to read, Rob. It's all blown out.
How people make, how people maintain the work required by software, the structure of an open source project, GitHub as a platform, roles, incentives, relations. Gotcha. So it's all about, it sounds like a documentary. Well, I was going to say documentary film. It sounds like a study on open source.
And she has a previous work called Roads and Bridges that is also kind of a more broad overview of open source and how it works in the world. Like, what is the role of open source in the world, how much we rely on it, and also how little support goes into it. And, like, where does the funding for open source come from? How is it sustainable. Like it's not super sustainable right now. People burn out. Most open source projects have just one or two maintainers, and we rely on them. Looking at like OpenSSL, the project, there's like a handful of people. Early on, there was like one or two people. They worked full time on it, and they suffered for it. Right? They didn't make the kind of salaries that someone of their expertise would make, and every credit card transaction in the world goes over OpenSSL essentially, right? And there's like one or two people working on it, and then there's like a massive, bug that's found eventually, like Heartbleed. It was in OpenSSL for quite a long time, and then people freak out and they're like, "What? How is this possible?" And you're like, "Well, because nobody paid these people. Like nobody ever put any resources into this project except these volunteers." And every company's like, "Well, it's not our responsibility to support open source." So it's a super, like her stuff, her works are amazing. It's such a great deep dive and research into open source. If you're interested in open source and how it works and want to understand it, maybe before, if it's feeling a little scary to you, or you're thinking about how do I get into open source? How does open source work? What does it even mean? Those are both really good books to start with.
Navi just dropped a link to the Amazon page for that book. I don't think it has any referrer tags on that, so we're not getting paid for this. We're dropping it because I think it's a great concept, and I'm going to pick that book up. So I have tons and tons of questions, and they're just pouring in. I have 1, 2, 3, 4. Can we do a lightning round? There's no way.
You say a question.
Yeah.
And we'll give a super short answer.
Yeah.
Pick questions that are able to have short answers.
Cool. How about you tell me when you want to skip one?
Okay.
Because it can't do a short answer. How about that? Okay, sounds good. So first one I already asked. Claire Froelich asks, in a convention over configuration framework, how does the Redwood team make decisions about opinions?
We use by just, you talk about it, you figure out what feels right, and we use our past experiences to kind of decide. It's mostly a feeling, honestly. Like a lot of it is we'll be in, we'll chat, the core team chats, or it's in a forum post, and we just talk about it, right? We did this recently with, we're talking about generators, and right now you use generators to create your auth. Like if you want to install authentication for Netlify identity or something, you say Redwood, yarn Redwood generate auth Netlify. But then we wanted to add like something to install Tailwind. And so like that doesn't really feel like a generator. Like you're not generating a Tailwind install. It's kind of weird. So then we're talking about like, okay, we should probably have a separate command to do it. So generators, you would run a bunch of times and edit the code that they're produced. But this other thing is more like an installation. You run it once and it sets it up for you. And so we were like, well, what's it called? Is it install? Is it add? Like this is a separate command. So it'd be yarn Redwood install, or yarn Redwood add, or yarn Redwood. And then Dom, one of our guys, suggested setup. And we were like, well, which one should it be? And so we just decided on setup. Like you work through the possibilities and then you choose based on what feels right.
Sweet. In next one, so David D asked, what inspired you to co-found GitHub? And I guess we can limit this to 20 words or less. Let's do that. So what inspired you to co-found GitHub? And what do you think about other VCS systems in comparison to Git?
I needed a side project and I wanted GitHub to exist.
And what do you think about other VCS systems compared to Git?
Say it.
How diplomatic should I be?
Say it, man. Just say it.
I think don't be diplomatic. I mean, if you want to work with open source, or you want to work at most companies, or you want to code in general, you should learn Git. If you want to learn some of the other ones, I think they have some different and interesting concepts that you could learn from, but they're just they're not used very often. So like you could learn, it's like learning an esoteric programming language. It's like, sure, you can learn, I can't even say the name of one. I could say
Cool.
Haskell.
I'm going to cut that
Haskell
off right
is an
there.
amazing language,
20 words.
and it's actually used a lot at GitHub right now for when you click on a type and to go to a type definition. One of our early guys, Tim Clem, works with Haskell now. He's a good friend of mine. and they do amazing work. But if you're going to go learn Haskell, you're going to do it because you're like, this is an interesting language. I'm probably not ever going to be employed doing this unless you go work at GitHub or the handful of companies where they're using Haskell, right? And so the same would be true of Mercurial or Darks or like these are super, like Darks spelled DARCS. Like that was one that was a player back when there was like the VCS wars. Right when we started GitHub, it was like, well, who's going to win, Git or Mercurial or Darks is cool. Fossil has some neat stuff, and they all have stuff that I think each could learn from the other, but Git is the best.
Speaking of Git and GitHub, Navi's question is, can you talk about Tom's journey? And since it's a lightning round, in a nutshell, Tom, what's your journey been like?
My journey.
Or what is it?
I'd say my journey is the crux of my journey always has been, I like to create things and I like to learn new things. Those are the things that drive me. So everything in my life stems from those, essentially. The desire to learn how to program was because it felt really neat and powerful to be able to create, and I like learning things. Working for startups, same thing. Startups are really good at creating things, and you learn a lot in a startup environment. Like it's a very stressful, high, fast-paced environment. I worked for myself for a couple of years doing consulting because it was, because it's the hard thing. I like doing the hard thing. A few years ago, I learned how to fly helicopters because I like to learn things, and that's not so much creative, but it's like what I wanted to be a pilot. And so you could, if you want to be a pilot, for the abstract notion of being a pilot, you could learn to fly an airplane, or you could learn to fly a helicopter or some other, more esoteric type of a vehicle. But those are the two main ones. Learning to fly an airplane is the more common and easier thing to do. And so I chose helicopters because I like pursuing the things that are hard and that are going to force me to have to grow. So that's give you the reasons why I've done all the things that I've done, and you can extrapolate the rest of my journey from that.
Yeah. This one's for I'm going to shoot this one at Rob. So there's a question from Elaine Ibrahim. I would like to ask a question about polyfilling. So he wants to know, it's not about polyfilling. He wants to know, is there a chart that shows the browser and the minimum browser versions that
I linked it, I think,
do you have that up somewhere?
Page room, but here's our Babel config. And even after looking at that, the string we're using is defaults. Whatever the Babel's current defaults are, I don't know where you look those up at. Do you know where those are, Tom? I guess you Babel and it maybe that's like
not offhand.
I'm not sure.
Okay. And Babel, how
so it's looking at your JavaScript and seeing, you're using some feature of ES6 or ES7 or ES8, or I guess they're named by years now. And, if that's not supported in, let's say you want to be able to support IE 11, it will sort of, add an entire huge chunk of JavaScript to make that compatible, so that whatever feature isn't available, you can it's always backwards compatible in some way using classic ES, I guess, 5 JavaScript. So it'll add a whole bunch of JavaScript to make that function work in IE 11. And it'll make your package size bigger and bigger because you have all this extra JavaScript that most browsers don't need. But if you really need to support IE 11, then you can polyfill that and get that in there.
Gotcha. Another one for Rob. I think this is a good one for you. Newbie question: how does this all work in FTP servers? And do you scratch that in lieu of redirection from Netlify?
Well, we talked about the Jamstack having the
is.
CDN half, and there's your FTP. You just upload your finished compiled files to your FTP server. The serverless section, that might be a different beast. I'm not sure how that would work with FTP. Tom, do you have any ideas about that?
I don't. What even? I haven't heard those 3 letters together in a long time. You don't need to use FTP anymore. There are better ways.
Maybe there's a startup there making an FTP interface for AWS Lambda. That could be your startup.
Get some web dev. Put some web dev on top of it too. While you have it.
Oh God. This is hurting me, guys. All right, why Prisma and why? Okay, this one's from Claire Froelich. Me and her have talked about Connects in Prisma a lot recently. Why Prisma? Why not Connects or another ORM or query writer?
Well,
why,
when we
why
were first
Prisma?
working on Redwood, we tried out a lot of them. We tried out Connects. We tried out Objection and Type ORM. We tried out a bunch of the sort of ORM query builder solutions, and just none of them felt like they could touch what Active Record was in the Rails world. Active Record is a very polished, very powerful ORM. And so that was our sort of expectation for what we wanted in a framework. And it's like, well, if you can't get anywhere near Active Record, like you can't, how can you build a framework if you can't do that well? It seemed impossible, right? And so that was a bit discouraging. And right around that same time, the Prisma people started working on the Prisma client. Or they had been working on it a while, and they finally had put something out that we could look at. So we got in touch with them and started playing around with it. And it was like, finally, this is something that feels like it could go head to head eventually with Active Record and hold its own. And it was just about how it's used, how you define relationships, also the roadmap, like what they wanted to support, that they wanted to eventually support a really broad range of databases. That was what we wanted for Redwood, so that you could bring what you wanted with you, so that you could kind of use the same model that you had been used to in the Rails world. And especially that's why we wanted to support relational databases, because for me, that's still the workhorse of web application development. You're going to have a relational database. Maybe you'll have some kind of a NoSQL or different kind of database on top of that if you're doing specialized things. But like, you kind of want a relational database no matter what, or at least I do. And so Prisma could offer that. Prisma had a really great set of tools. They felt good. The developer experience was sufficiently good enough that we thought it could fit within the Redwood universe, and we didn't want to write our own because it's a huge monumental task to do it well. And so that's why we chose it over any of the others. It was better.
Those are high compliments, because I've used ORMs in Rails, and Active Record is by far the best ORM I've ever touched in any language on any stack. And every time I use an ORM elsewhere, I regret it. Spring, Hibernate, ORM, doesn't matter. I'm not going to name more names, but no, I've already dropped one. Hibernate just gives me a lot of pain, and those are really high compliments. Moving on to the next lightning round question.
Claire who came to my talk. We talked, and Claire opened up a PR against docs and fixed some docs on RedwoodJS shortly after my presentation. Thank you, Claire. Assuming that's the same Claire, maybe it's a different Claire. In that case, never mind.
Go Claire.
But welcome.
So Claire's actually working on our core. So she's working with us. She's on the McBean team. So go Claire. So the next one is Alex Verga. How are you addressing the performance downsides of flat routing scheme versus nested routing scheme? So I'm guessing Redwood goes with flat routing scheme. Nested routing scheme.
So React Router, Reach Router both have a nested scheme, because that's really what you kind of need to work in the React world without having to do a bunch of repaints when you switch from one page to another. Redwood, we've written our own router because I really wanted to preserve the kind of single file flat routing document that Rails has. Like, that was one of the things that I find actually really great about Rails is if you want to figure out at least the first part of it, it's like you want to figure out what URL goes to what code. Like this is a fairly common thing, right? Like you're looking at your website, there's some bug, someone reported an issue. Hey, this page has a problem. Here's the URL. And like one of the most basic tasks you can ever do in a framework is figure out which code is running on that page. And when you start nesting your URLs, it becomes almost impossible to do that in a simple way. You have to go track through a bunch of files and go, the nesting is all over the place. And in Rails, you find the URL and then you look for where it is in the list, and you can see exactly which controller that maps to and which action on that controller it calls. And then you can go and you can find that code. Finding other things, like finding other bits of code in Rails, can be nightmarishly very difficult. And that's another power of React, is that if you can look at the React inspector and you can look at a component and it's like, oh, here's the name of the component. Like that's like just that one thing makes working on React-based applications like 1,000 times more awesome that you just can always look at that component and know what that component is. And then you can inspect it and you can even see the props that went into it. Like it's just, it's amazing, it's the best. So I really like that flat routing scheme from Rails. And I thought it would be really cool if you could do the same thing in Redwood. That comes at the expense of causing issues when you change pages and you're using a layout and you want to not re-render the layout. But when you switch when you're not nested, you need to kind of get in there in order to not cause that repaint where you need to be inside the layout and then have your sub bits inside the layout. And so we have not solved that yet, but I'm fairly sure that we can do it using computer science. So it's on the list.
The fact that we have our own router speaks a lot to Tom's like computer programming philosophy. Just, 99% of developers would use React Router or Reach Router and call it a day. But for us, Tom was like, that experience is just not what I want it to be. So I'm going to write my own router. So now we have it. And it works great. It's super easy.
This is so we can answer maybe someone's previous question or I'm sure questions that people have, which is like, why do you do open source? How do you get into it? Like how do you come up with ideas or where, like, why do some people do open source or, why are some projects popular? How does all that work? And for me, it always comes from being unsatisfied with the status quo. And this is true of startups as well, and many things in life. Is if you're using something and you're like, well, this is okay, but it could be better, right? Then you file that away as like, oh, like, why is that not better? Is there some solution out there that I don't know of, or is there no solution? And oftentimes there's no solution. So it's always where the pain is. And so almost all of my projects, whether that's a startup or an open source project, they come exactly from this feeling of this thing isn't good enough. Like the status quo is not sufficiently good enough. So GitHub came from that. It was like, here's Git, this version control system that's super powerful, but very difficult to use because there's no way to share code very well. You have to have accounts on like a Linux server and then give people credentials. And like, that's just bad. It's just a bad experience. Like it's not up to the level of polish that I would expect or that I want or that I can imagine being possible. And so it was like, all right, well, I'm a web developer and I have the knowledge and the tools to make this work, to create a website for sharing Git repositories. And like, that's all the idea was in the very beginning. There was nothing fancy about it. It was just like, I want a decent website to be able to share my code in a Git repository. Like that was it, right? So an idea, a very big, powerful startup idea can sometimes just be that simple. Right, and often they are. The best startups have an explanation or reason to exist that is like 5 words long. Right, they're super. They can be very super simple, and then everything else is that way too. Hey, I want to not keep losing my blog in a database every 2 years because the host that I put my WordPress thing went out of business or I just, I lost I don't know. I kept losing all the data to my blog. This is less of a problem today, but exactly because of these tools that exist like Jekyll, where it's like, why would you put the source for your blog in a database? I mean, it's funny because now, people now we're using headless CMSs in our contents back in databases again, but that's another story. But the idea behind Jekyll was like, let's not put my blog content in a database. Like it's simple enough that it doesn't need to be in a database. So let's not, and let's put it in a Git repository because guess what? Since the beginning of GitHub, I've never lost code in that like 15 years, 12, 13 years. I've never lost a single byte of code or content that I've created because when I put it on GitHub, I know that it will always be there forever. I'll never ever lose it. And so if my blog is in GitHub, I will never ever lose my blog, right? And that's why Jekyll exists. Because I'm sick of losing my damn blog content, right? That's why Jekyll exists. Or TOML, the configuration language.
It really sucks.
Every configuration language is garbage. They're all terrible. YAML is an abomination. JSON is not suitable for configuration files. It has you can't do comments. It doesn't have an appropriate set of types. YAML is not unambiguously mappable to a hash. Like, why would you have a configuration file that you can't look at and say, I know exactly what the hash table that this is going to turn into looks like, right? Where things could be like, maybe this is a string, but maybe it's a Boolean. I don't know. Who could possibly know? It infuriated me.
Oh my God, Ontario has ON as its province code. You know what that goes in? Yeah, it turns into true. That's true.
Right? So I kept looking at these configuration formats, and people kept using YAML, and I was like, YAML is not good enough. YAML is terrible. YAML is terrible for being a configuration format, and so I kept threatening for years to write my own spec. And then one time
And you've written it, right?
So TOML,
you have a public site
so
now.
Rob just
it's
designed
TOML.io,
a nice
I
site
think.
for it, and that's live. It's TOML, TOML, TOML.io. And so now a bunch of projects use this configuration language. It's used by quite a few things, like for instance, Netlify. So the way you tell Netlify to do certain things is you create a netlify.toml file, and that's how you do it. Anyway, you can check it out. But if you want a kick, if you want a nice fun thing to do, go find the first commit in the TOML repository and go read the initial version of the spec. Because my wife went on a business trip or something, and I was home, and I had a few drinks, and I started writing it because I was like, this. Finally, I got angry enough to sit down and write it down, and I wrote it in a really snarky way. But then like the next day, people started writing after I released it, and I just tweeted it out, and then people started writing parsers for it. And it was so simple that people could put a parser together for it in like a few hours. And so all of my open source, all of my startups, they come from the status quo being insufficient. And so for anyone who wants to work on open source, I think the same is true. And don't listen to the people that tell you not to create the 19th, there's a famous XKCD comic that's like, there's two engineers or something, and one of them's like, the way that everyone does their outlets is terrible in the world, right? Like, why are there so many different standards for outlets? Like, why can't there just be one? And then they're like, we're going to create the one that actually works, right? And then the subtitle something like, and now there's 19 standards, right? So I just want to say, screw that comic. There should always be more. There should always be more options, more attempts, because eventually one of them will be good enough that it will be the one that everyone uses, right? Like everything that's good today is because someone created the 19th version of something, right? Like this is just how it works. So we always need the 19th version, always. And don't listen to anyone who tells you not to create, another one, right? I don't like that. If you have a different angle, even if it's just slight, go for it, right? And just, and pick something like a static site generator is a great place to start, right? You're like, all these static site generators are cool. I want to create, my blog and run it with a static site generator. Just write your own and then open source it. Boom. Now you're an open source, author.
I made one.
Right? If nobody uses it, who cares? Like that's how you start.
That's how
I have a bunch of open source projects that nobody has ever used. Like really good ones too, that we used at GitHub for like legit backend infrastructure for like 5 years, and like nobody ever used them. So if it solves a problem for you, if it's interesting, if it's a way to learn, go for it and just put it out there. That's how you become an open source person.
Hey, Rob, you scratched your own itch about we're running up on time. It is now 5:03 Eastern. I want to do a quick time check. Are we good for 10 more minutes? Awesome. So, Rob, you scratched your own itch recently. Something to do with repeater. So what was the problem?
Yeah. So as we were getting into Jamstack and Redwood,
in the same vein,
one of the problems we found was, the CDN and the serverless is great when you need to do something right now, serve a web page, or if you need to send someone an email right now. But what if you need to send someone an email 5 minutes from now, or tomorrow, or send a drip campaign where you're sending an email, the first day and the third day and the fifth day? There's no way to do that because everything in the Jamstack needs to be triggered usually by a web request to start things going. So we looked at how we can solve that problem. So I put together something called Repeater. It's available at repeater.dev, and it's a background job processing queue. So you can basically create a job that say, I want you to call this serverless endpoint. And this is sort of assuming the Netlify model where when you create these serverless functions, they're available at a HTTP address somewhere on the internet. So you can always hit those from somewhere. So the idea is you tell Repeater, hey, hit this endpoint for me at 5 o'clock 2 days from now. and repeater will hit that endpoint. The serverless function will do its processing, and then repeater will record the response. Hopefully a 200, but maybe it's a 500 or a 400. Something went wrong, and then you can later on query repeater. Hey, what was the status of that job that I ran? And the interface to repeater is of course GraphQL, so it plays really well with Redwood. And I just recently put up a big doc site, so you have to create an account on repeater. It's completely free. And then you'll see there's a link to the docs there on the left. You get a big documentation list of all the endpoints, what they all do. You can view a little bit of stuff through the UI. You can like view your current outstanding jobs and all your job results that have run. But really, it's meant to be used through the GraphQL interface.
And that's repeater.dev. So I dropped that over there. That was a pain point that we came across. We were doing some client work for a company called Heyorka. They do Twitter. They're a social media management SaaS platform. So we were doing a Twitter integration for them. Same problem back then. And they basically said, you know what, let us just handle it. So they have to go through an engineering spree just to make sure that they have all their job trigger, the heartbeat down pat. So it's not, that was a problem that I definitely came across.
Yeah, one of our core community members, David, he actually just released sort of like a part 2 of our blog tutorial where he really like styles it up, makes it really nice, and actually has the full role-based authentication built in. And what he wanted to do is, every 24 hours, basically, because he leaves the admin access open, so you can go in and create blog posts and see how it works. But the problem is it'll just be filled with thousands and thousands of junk blog posts. So every night he has a job that runs on repeater that just redeploys the site, so it wipes out the database and starts over fresh. And that's a perfect use case for it. Yeah, actually, as Tom was talking about,
Rob also gave us Cameron.js.
I did the same thing in JavaScript because I just wanted one where I just wrote HTML. Like I didn't really want to write Markdown. I didn't want to write React components. I just wanted to write HTML and CSS. And actually, I used a stimulus kind of borrowed from Rails as just a little bit of sprinkle of JavaScript. So actually, that's one of our dirty secrets is that the Redwood RedwoodJS.com is actually built with Cameron.js. It's not really an interactive.
Also, you should know that Redwood is actually not the first web framework that Rob and I have created. We actually created together, but mostly Rob, a web framework back in the day called Cold Fusion on Wheels.
That's right. Those are taking Ruby and
Rails. Oh yeah, Rob mentioned that.
Yeah, so if Ruby on Rails for Cold Fusion. I started my life as a Cold Fusion developer, and I really loved how Rails thought about things. But at the time, my full-time job was Cold Fusion, and there was no way I could bridge that gap. So I sort of brought those concepts, as many as we could. Me and Tom could figure out how to do in Cold Fusion. Like there was a few that I don't think we ever figured out how to do it, but there were plenty of things. It's like, is this even possible to do in Cold Fusion? And eventually, hacking away at it, we figured out how to do it. So, and it's still under active development. People still maintain it and still used.
Yeah, it's a real framework. Cold Fusion on Wheels. That was like the dumbest name we could think of for it. We're like, what should it be called? I don't know. Ruby on Rails is cool, so it should be Cold Fusion on something. Cold Fusion on Wheels makes no sense. But it's fun though. Sometimes you just have an idea and it's just like the classic hack. It's like, is this even possible? Like, can this even be done with Cold Fusion? The language, will it even let you do this? Then we went, we were digging through documentation and like doing, calling commands that like nobody was using because like, why would you do that in Cold Fusion? That we had to dig up and it was, sometimes it's just fun.
Yeah, the idea, like for anyone out there, like the idea of building a framework is an extremely large, daunting thought. But if you think about, I just want to do authentication in a new way. And then you put that. Now you got that. Now I want to make forms in a unique way, and you add forms on. And pretty soon you actually have built a framework. But you didn't do it as like, I am going to build a framework. It's just too much to think about at once. You do it.
Yeah, I'm just really, really happy that you didn't call RedwoodJS jails, considering you guys have cells.
Ooh, that's a good one. I hadn't even thought of that.
We have
JavaScript in jail. That's why they're called cells. Well, cells is that's another funny. Like we came up with the name for cells like really early on, and we're like, cells is not a very good name for this. Like what should we call these? And we could just never think of anything that was better.
Yeah, there was a concept in Rails called cells. I think we borrowed that name. Some guy had made a gem for Rails called cells, and it was a similar thing, sort of wrapping data access inside of a view.
Yeah.
Ooh. I like getting these deep insights into frameworks because I really, one day somebody's going to come up and start a history department for programming languages, and this is the kind of stuff that they should know about. That's really interesting. The genealogy of frameworks.
How did Tom and I meet each other? Yeah, Tom actually mentioned, he was in college. He started working for a company, Mind Cruiser. What was the software actually called? It was like knowledge management. Is that what they called it?
Yeah, it was actually originally called Infostry. And then we changed our names to Mind Cruiser because Infostry is obviously not a very good name. So we changed our name to Mind Cruiser. It was like, the idea was kind of like Yahoo Answers, I guess, became. It's like everybody has some expertise they want to share. So let's create a Q&A site where people can ask questions about whatever, and then other people can come on and they can provide answers. So it was essentially just it was like a Q&A site. And then we had like rewards that you could earn if you got enough points. And there were like ridiculous things that nobody could ever earn on there. There was like a spacesuit or something. I don't know. There was a bunch of like stuff that you put it on there because it's like, oh wow, someday I could earn a car. And you're like, nobody will ever earn a car. Like it's just not feasible. But that was bought by the company that Rob worked at, which is called Akiva. Well, what was it? The original name was ChatSpace, right?
They made it was like a chat room and like a message board, but for companies. Webboard was the name of the product. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of it, but yeah, and then they rebranded to Akiva. But yeah, that company bought Tom's company. Yeah, that's how we met. I was in
I moved down.
Yeah, I was in Carlsbad, was where our company was.
Yeah, I think the reason that the first thing I can remember about knowing you, or that like we were like, we need to be friends, was for some reason we got talking about knots or something, like knots you make out of rope. And I was in the Boy Scouts and I like knots. And for some reason, Rob, I don't know, it came up and I was like, knots are amazing. And Rob was like, yeah, knots are amazing. And then I think you got me a book. You got me a book on knots or something. And I was like, yeah, we have to be friends.
Something I would do, yeah. We used to play Go in the break room. That was fun.
Yeah. Yeah, that was almost 20 years ago.
Gotcha. I have
probably 2003 maybe.
I have a few friends who generously let me crew on their boats, and I only know how
to tie one knot. I mean, if you're going to know one knot,
I just know how to tie bowlines. I don't know how to tie any other knots. Apparently, you can do it behind your back and tie you up in case somebody throws you a line.
Yeah, good for tents as well.
If I fell out of that boat. Knots are, I use knots as, in my head, it's like an analogy for programming. If anybody asks me, what's a development pattern? I'll say, you have a book of knots, go read a book of knots, because that's basically what a programming pattern is. Cool, so we're running up on time, and I wanted to ask Tom, Tom, you've been engaged in social enterprise quite a lot recently, and I wanted to ask you if, why social enterprise? What are the problems that you're trying to solve? And where do you see that side of your
Are you talking about
and your business going?
Preston-Werner Ventures? Okay, so my wife and I started what we call Preston-Werner Ventures. It's sort of our umbrella for all of the investing that we do, for-profit as well as nonprofit grant making that we do. So it's kind of it's an LLC that covers sort of all of those kinds of activities. So we do a lot of grant making around family planning and women's health around the world, a lot of international work in that regard. And we also now are getting a lot more into climate action. So we just hired a climate expert that's on staff now. And we're looking at what are the best ways to put money and resources and use whatever we have to be able to move the needle on climate. So this year it's all about the election. We're not going to make any headway on climate if Trump is elected again. It's not going to happen. Going to war with China is going to mean that we'll never make significant headway on climate. Like we have to work together as an international community on this. And so we're thinking a lot about it and putting money towards it. So those are some of the big efforts that we do. I also fund an organization called Hack Club, which is more of a personal interest. So that's clubs for high schoolers. Hackclub.com. They're amazing. And sometimes I buy laptops for students. So for my 41st birthday, I said I'd give away 41 laptops, which are pretty much all in the hands of students that are part of Hack Club. They're high school students. So those have been distributed around the world. And it's just amazing. Like something as simple as $1,000 MacBook Air, which is what I gave away, can be a bifurcation point in a young person's life. The ability to code and to be able to access this industry and practice and have a good machine to be able to do that if you have the inclination, like the power of that is so large, massive difference in a person's life. And so it's something that I love doing. I'd love to do a lot more of it. Actually, Teresa and I, my wife, did a nonprofit a number of years ago called Code Starter, where we were doing something similar, but we were trying to do it more cheaply by being able to install Linux on Chromebooks. And so we had a whole distribution that we could put on Chromebooks to make them Linux machines. And we gave away about 500 laptops of these more inexpensive Chromebooks. We could do them for about $230 each. The problem is they were not as good as they really needed to be. Like they could kind of get the job done, but the Linux had not quite come up to speed with Chromebook hardware yet. This was fairly early when people were trying to do that. So we made some headway, but it was really hard. Doing nonprofits is super hard. Giving away money is a lot easier, it turns out. So that's, I don't know. It's just, this is, you know, we want to give back to the world. You know, we have resources to do that. And within our lifetimes, we want to make a big impact and do what we can. You know, I have a lot of advantages in the world. A lot of luck came my way, and I think that we can bring some of those advantages and luck to other people in the world.
Are you guys coming up to Canada and doing something around here? Because over here, this is something that even way before we started talking, Indigenous communities over here, they have. It's always been in the back of my mind, where if we could somehow get boot camps and coding knowledge and resources to Indigenous communities, then you could enrich those communities just by doing remote work, which is totally possible at extremely good salaries in the software development industry. So that's something that was in the back of my mind. So I totally get where you're coming from on that, where just giving somebody a laptop is enough. Yep. To really change a community, I think. So that's really commendable. It's massive. Great. I wanted to thank you guys for being so generous with your time and for coming over here today. I don't know if I dropped anything. If you feel like I dropped anything, or if I forgot to mention something, just spit it out.
No,
guys.
that's good. I'll put in a quick plug for Chatterbug, which is my current startup. And you go to chatterbug.com. If you want to learn a foreign language, then you could learn French, German, Spanish, or English. You probably know English if you're watching this, though. And so that's a startup I've been working on for a couple of years with one of my other co-founders of GitHub, Scott Chacon. So we got back together, and the founding team is another couple of GitHubbers. So it was exciting for me to get back working with some of my friends from my GitHub days. And it's been a really neat project to work on, hoping to be able to make it easier for people to learn languages. And our model is that you take 45-minute live lessons with native speakers. And if you want to get good at something like learning and speaking a language, you have to practice it. Like there's just no way that you can do that with something that doesn't force you to practice speaking, like Duolingo. You'll never learn a language with Duolingo. It's not possible. You'll never learn to speak it because you have to practice speaking it to speak it, like long form with real actual people. But the flip side of that is if we employ tutors and we provide a platform for them to become effective tutors, you don't necessarily have to have a background or education in being a language instructor. So really anyone can become a Chatterbug tutor. And if we can scale this thing up, then we could provide tens of thousands of jobs to people anywhere in the world, because everybody is an expert at speaking their own language. So that's what got me really interested in Chatterbug in the first place. And it turns out it's a really hard industry to get into. Creating curriculum, we've created all our own curriculum, is a huge capital intensive thing to do. It takes a lot of time, and it's a busy space. So definitely learning. This is another one of these things. We do it because it's hard, because it's interesting, and it's a big learning experience, but it could have a lot of impact if we pull it off.
So you guys built your own curriculum. So it's not just you're hooking up teachers with students, because I can't remember the platform, but I did that and the teacher basically gave up on me. I was trying to learn French, and he said, "You know what? You're nowhere close to the level where I thought you were.
Ouch.
I can't teach you because I'm better than you." And it just broke my heart. So what's this curriculum? Wait, what? I thought it was just
it's a whole
you're hooking
curriculum
teachers
as
up with
well,
students,
and
so it's
with
not
self-study. So we've got flashcards and readings and things you can listen to, videos to watch. So there's a whole element that is more like Babbel or Duolingo, where you're doing it just with the computer, just you're doing self-study. But then we combine it with these live lessons, 45-minute long live lessons. And you kind of, the best cadence is to bounce back and forth between our curriculum that you do yourself, and then you practice speaking it with a tutor, and you can do it all on your own schedule. You just schedule it whenever you want. And it ends up being a lot cheaper than an in-person school where you're going to be in a group class anyway. And so we've shown extremely good efficiency. Like you can learn twice as fast as you would in a group class. And so we're going for sort of maximum efficiency and flexibility around language learning.
So I paid nearly $40 Canadian, which is like $30 US per hour. What is Duolingo averaging at?
No, it's okay.
I'm so sorry. Chatterbug.
It ends up being about
Chatterbug,
$15 to $20 per 45-minute session. Actually, less than that. It depends on which plan you're on.
That's pretty good.
But let's say, yeah, $13 to $15 actually. It's probably about where we clock in. Yeah, we're trying to be really affordable, and still be able to pay the tutors really well.
That's really good, and that's kind of tying back into. So is there a social venture aspect to it as well? Considering that that's been a theme, are you?
Yeah, I mean,
one
thing that we'd like to do eventually is work with immigrant communities that come in, or refugee communities in various areas, to be able to partner with local NGOs or people that are trying to help out these populations that are coming in with not being able to speak the language of the country that they're moving to, and be able to provide language learning resources to them at a free or much cheaper rate, because that's such a huge part of integration into a new community, is learning to speak the language. So we'd love to be able. We haven't done a huge amount of that yet, but we'd love to get there.
Peter Birkenbosch just validated that hypothesis for you. He said his wife is Canadian, moved to the Netherlands. Dutch is a terrible language, but talking with people works best for sure. And I'd add Dutch to Chatterbug.
Someday.
That would be awesome if you add Dutch to Chatterbug. Claire, what stack are you using?
I mean, Redwood really comes out of sort of the learning
or are you using
Chatterbug. No, Chatterbug we started as a very plain Rails site, because that's what we knew at the time, and we wanted to just get it spun up as quickly as possible. The front end now is more and more React all the time, and so it's turning into sort of like all the modern stuff that we build with it is all React on the front end that talks GraphQL to the back end, which is a GraphQL API built on top of Rails. So Rails is becoming basically just the GraphQL API in the same way that Redwood. So the front end ends up looking a lot like Redwood, actually, in the way that the website of Redwood is. And the backend is just an alternate implementation of a GraphQL API. So it kind of looks like Redwood in some ways, because Redwood comes out of a lot of the learnings that we had in trying to make this stuff work the way we wanted to at Chatterbug.
So I guess, how long have you been working at Chatterbug again? Okay, because that makes sense, because I heard that you were working on that cells pattern for a couple of years before you started on Redwood. I don't know if that's true or if that comes out of Chatterbug.
You know, we actually started working in earnest on Redwood probably a year and a half or a little more ago. So it hasn't been that long. But cells, some of the ideas for cells maybe came out of work that we were doing. You'd have to ask Peter, actually. He's the one that is more the React expert. Actually, I just started learning React like, I don't know, 3 years ago. So I'm not that long into React myself, but like once I started learning it, I was like, it
blows your mind. It blows your mind.
Future. This is amazing.
Yeah, I always say React is
don't say that
our
though,
generation, because it just blows your mind when you start
where's it going to go? Nobody will use it in a decade.
Well, fair. Guys, thank you. This has been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Had a lot of fun shooting the breeze with you guys, and the whole community is super grateful to you. I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of a bunch of people, but thank you for coming here. We'll be putting this up on YouTube, and yeah, I need to get somebody to turn all this content into a digestible format. But we're
thanks so much for having us, and thanks so much for everyone who came and listened. And we very much welcome you into the Redwood community. If you care to join, check it out, ask us questions. It's all good.
Yep. Thanks for having us. Was there 36 people? We expect to see 36 new pull requests, please, in the next.